They weren't supposed to make it. In the early 2000s, Papa Roach looked like just another nu metal band riding the MTV wave. One viral song, heavy eyeliner, and a fade into obscurity. Critics wrote them off. The industry didn't expect them to last, but they didn't fade. They evolved. Now, 3 decades later, Papa Roach is still headlining festivals, pulling in over 14 million monthly Spotify listeners, and collaborating with viral TikTok stars. Their most iconic song has over 1 billion streams. And here's the real twist. The very thing that made them a target of ridicule, their honesty, is exactly what built their legacy. So how did a band that critics laughed off in 2000 become one of the most influential rock acts of the 21st century? This is the strange, chaotic, and ultimately inspiring history of Papa Roach. It all started on a high school football field. In January 1993, a teenage Jacoby Shaddix met drummer Dave Buckner during warm-ups at Vacaville High School in California. The two clicked instantly, not over sports, but over their love for music. Within months, they'd formed a band. Guitarist Jerry Horton joined shortly after, and Papa Roach was born. Well, not exactly. At first, they were called Papa Gatto, a weird name, even for a high school band. Eventually, Jacoby ditched it and combined the nicknames of his grandfathers, Papa and Roach, to create something more personal, something that would stick. By 1994, they'd released their first EP, Potatoes for Christmas. It wasn't exactly a masterpiece. The production was rough, the songwriting was all over the place, but it showed sparks, hints of the firestorm that was coming. They followed up with their first full album, Old Friends from Young Years, in 1997. This was heavier, angrier, and more focused. You could hear early traces of what would eventually become their signature sound. But outside of a small local scene, nobody really noticed. It wasn't on the radio, it wasn't on TV, it was nearly impossible to find. They were broke, unknown, barely scraping together enough gas money for local gigs. But they didn't stop. Because beneath all the chaos and distortion, they had something most bands didn't. A frontman who was writing lyrics like they were therapy sessions. Songs that bled emotion, that talked about things nobody else wanted to admit. Pain, trauma, and the darkest corners of the mind. And when the world finally heard it, it changed everything. The shift came in 1999. DreamWorks Records, yes, the same DreamWorks behind Shrek, signed Papa Roach for their first major label release. It was a huge break, but also a massive gamble. The label already had Korn and Limp Bizkit. Did they really need another nu metal band? That answer came in April 2000. Infest dropped, and one track exploded like nothing else on the radio. Last Resort, you know the riff. Even if you haven't listened to the band in years, you probably still know the words. It was the kind of song that took over everything. Music videos, skate shops, school hallways. But behind the catchy hook and frantic vocals was something much heavier. Cut my life into pieces. This is my last resort. At the time, almost no one in mainstream music was talking openly about self-harm or mental health. Papa Roach didn't hint at it. They screamed it out loud. Raw, unfiltered, and brutally honest. Critics hated it. They called it emo, melodramatic, angsty nonsense. But millions of kids heard something else. They heard someone saying what they were too scared to say themselves. And it resonated hard. Last Resort wasn't just a hit. It became a generational anthem. The kind of song that made people pick up a guitar, start a band, or finally feel seen. The Infest album went triple platinum. Papa Roach went from nobodies to headliners in a matter of weeks. The track Blood Brothers even made it onto Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, which at the time was the cultural jackpot. From the outside, it looked like they had made it. But inside the band, things were about to get a lot more complicated. The success of Infest brought money, tours, and pressure. Everyone expected Papa Roach to do it again, to bottle the same chaos and vulnerability and turn it into another global hit. But Jacoby Shaddix wasn't the same person anymore. Neither was the band. In 2002, they dropped their follow-up album, Love, Hate, Tragedy. It wasn't a flop, but it didn't match the commercial explosion of Infest. It leaned more into traditional rock, less rapping, more singing, more melody, more experimentation. Some fans loved it, others felt betrayed. The critics, they barely noticed. Still, the album charted higher in the US and UK than its predecessor and went gold in just 2 months. But even with that, it was clear Papa Roach wasn't just trying to be the nu metal band with the Suicide Song. They were trying to evolve. And by 2004, they were ready to break away from the genre that had both elevated and boxed them in. Their third major release, Getting Away with Murder, marked a clean cut from their nu metal roots. Gone were the rap verses, gone were the baggy pants and Rage Against the World posturing. In came radio-friendly choruses, power chords, and an almost arena rock sheen. But they weren't playing it safe. Tracks like Scars dug even deeper emotionally than anything they'd done before. Where Last Resort was a scream for help, Scars was the quiet aftermath, the apology, the regret, the self-awareness, and it resonated. The song became one of their biggest hits ever. Getting Away with Murder went platinum. Papa Roach was officially no longer a nu metal band. They were something harder to define and more dangerous to underestimate, but success doesn't always mean stability. By 2006, the band was riding high again. They released the Paramore Sessions, named after the supposedly haunted Paramore mansion in LA, where they recorded it. A mansion that had been home to seances, celebrity meltdowns, and more than a few breakdowns. Maybe that energy seeped into the music. The album felt theatrical, like they were leaning into drama and performance. It fit perfectly with the WWE crowd, where their songs were booming through arenas filled with fireworks and body slams. But behind the scenes, things were fracturing. Drummer Dave Buckner left the band. Jacoby was battling personal demons, especially with addiction. The relentless touring was wearing everyone down. And then came Metamorphosis. Released in 2009, it should have been a victory lap. It debuted at number 8 on Billboard. Commercially, it was doing fine, but the reception, brutal. Critics called it hollow. Fans were lukewarm. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't memorable either. It felt like the band was moving without a compass, like they'd lost the fire. And then, just to twist the knife, their old label dropped a greatest hits album without their consent. No input, no royalties. Just a label cashing in on their back catalog like a pawn shop flipping old jewelry. It was a slap in the face. A reminder that, in the eyes of the industry, they were expendable, disposable, replaceable. But Papa Roach wasn't done yet, because in true cockroach fashion, they refused to die. After the Metamorphosis slump, most bands would have packed it in or become a nostalgia act. But Papa Roach doesn't operate like most bands. In 2012, they released The Connection, an album that wasn't just a return to form, it was a reintroduction. The record fused everything they'd ever been: rap, metal, rock, even electronic flourishes. But it worked. It didn't feel like a mashup. It felt like them. A lot of people slept on that album. Critics barely covered it, but the fans who gave it a chance, they knew. This wasn't just another attempt. It was a blueprint for where the band was headed. Then came Fear in 2015. This album didn't just show they were back. It proved they were paying attention. Tracks like Gravity featured guest vocals for the first time ever from Maria Brink of In This Moment, adding a haunting modern metal edge to their sound. Sonically, the album borrowed from newer metal movements, tight riffs, polished production, but it didn't feel like they were chasing trends. It felt like they were adapting to survive, and it worked. Then in 2017, Crooked Teeth hit, and this time the world noticed. The singles Help and Born for Greatness both hit #1 on the mainstream rock charts. 2 number ones. From a band that had been dismissed more than once as dead, it was a resurrection. And with WWE picking up Born for Greatness as the theme for Raw, Papa Roach was once again at the center of pop culture. They weren't just surviving, they were dominating. By now, Papa Roach had nothing to prove. They could have coasted, released Infest 2.0, stuck with what worked. Instead, they made a pop album. When Who Do You Trust dropped in 2019, it stunned everyone. Gone were the heavy riffs and emotional howls. In their place, synths, indie-style grooves, a sound that wouldn't feel out of place next to Imagine Dragons or the Arctic Monkeys. And fans were divided. Some called it fresh, others called it a betrayal. Critics were confused. What even was this? But Papa Roach didn't apologize, they owned it. For them, it wasn't about chasing a hit. It was about taking a breath, trying something wild, challenging themselves. And whether you loved it or hated it, it got people talking. But they weren't done pushing boundaries, because what came next might be their most unexpected move of all. 20 years after Infest, something strange happened. A young artist named Jairus Johnson posted a remix of Last Resort on TikTok. It wasn't just a cover, it was a reimagining. Sleek, punchy, packed with Gen Z energy, and it went viral. Now, most legacy bands would have freaked out, or worse, ignored it entirely. Not Papa Roach. They didn't just give it their blessing. They jumped in and re-recorded the song with him. The remix dropped in 2021, and it was a banger. Jairus brought a modern swagger. Jacoby brought his signature chaos. The old school angst and new school confidence collided, and fans from 2 generations were suddenly blasting Last Resort again. But this wasn't a nostalgia trip. This was a setup, because in 2022, Papa Roach dropped Ego Trip, an album that felt like everything Who Do You Trust tried to be, but executed perfectly. It was loud, modern, melodic, and aggressive. But most importantly, it felt real. Tracks like Kill the Noise and Swerve proved they could flex across genres without sounding like they were chasing TikTok trends. They weren't trying to be young. They were proving they were still dangerous, and the fans felt it. For many, Ego Trip was their best record since Getting Away with Murder or even Infest. It was bold, hook-heavy, and deeply self-aware. It also proved something bigger. Papa Roach wasn't stuck in the past. They were reshaping their future in real time. At this point, most bands from the nu metal era are either long gone or clinging to past glories. But Papa Roach, they're thriving. And not just because of viral remixes or updated riffs. Their true legacy goes deeper than that. Let's go back to Last Resort. In 2000, a song that bluntly mentioned self-harm was practically unheard of in mainstream rock. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't poetic, it was raw, and that made it dangerous. Radio stations hesitated, parents freaked out, but kids heard themselves in it. For the first time, a song on MTV was saying out loud what they were too scared to admit. I'm struggling, I'm scared, I don't want to pretend I'm okay anymore. And as the years passed, Jacoby Shaddix didn't hide from that message. He lived it. He opened up about his battles with addiction, with depression, with shame, but he also preached hope. He didn't glamorize the pain. He showed a way out. While so many artists lean into darkness just for aesthetic, Papa Roach kept one eye on the light at the end of the tunnel. That message, don't give up, there's still a reason to fight, became their signature, far more than any sound or lyric. And it's why they're still relevant today. They stayed connected, not just to the scene, but to people. Collaborating with Jairus Johnson wasn't a PR move. Neither was working with Ronnie Radke from Falling in Reverse, a band that arguably owes a huge chunk of its DNA to Papa Roach. Jacoby and crew weren't gatekeeping the next generation, they were handing them the torch. And in doing so, they lit themselves up again. Let's be real, nobody expected Papa Roach to be one of the last bands standing from their era. In the late 90s and early 2000s, nu metal was everywhere. So many of those bands burned bright and then burned out, fast. But Papa Roach did the opposite. They survived, not just musically, personally, spiritually. They took risks that pissed off fans. They dropped albums that didn't land. They got screwed by their label. They got mocked by critics. They lost band members. They fought addiction. And yet, they never stopped moving forward. Because at the core of this band isn't just distortion and screaming, it's vulnerability, it's honesty, and that's why they're still here. They weren't built to be trendsetters, they were built to be survivors. So the next time you hear Last Resort at a party, in a TikTok, or even in a stadium, remember that wasn't supposed to happen. That song wasn't supposed to last, but it did, just like the band that wrote it. Papa Roach didn't just infest the music world, they made it their home. If you made it this far, you're a real one. Let me know your favorite Papa Roach album in the comments, or which era of the band hits you the hardest. Hit that like button if you've ever screamed "cut my life into pieces" into your car steering wheel. Subscribe for more deep dives on the bands they said wouldn't last, but somehow outlasted everyone. I'll catch you in the next one.